If somebody is consuming, let's call it very intense, AKA high dopamine releasing pornography on a regular basis, what do we know? That peak in dopamine will start to lessen. It'll be lower and lower, and the trough in dopamine after they view that pornography will be deeper trough and longer trough, meaning they are very likely, we don't know for sure, but very likely to seek out more and more intense experiences to try and just get them back to baseline. Pretty soon, the pornography that at one time was very stimulating for them is no longer stimulating. Now, the concern here is that, and let's just be frank, we're not just talking about viewing pornography. We also have to ask ourselves, what are people doing as they view this pornography? This is a conversation that should be had, but I have to do it in a way where I'm not imparting moral judgment on any of it. I'm not saying people should masturbate or not masturbate. That's none of my business, frankly. This is highly individual. It relates to all sorts of things in terms of values, etc. The point is, however, that we know that orgasm is a dopamine-related event, and post-orgasm, there's a increase in a molecule called prolactin in the brain. Prolactin actually, in part, sets the refractory period in which there can't be further erection in males and orgasm in males. Here's the point. Dopamine and prolactin generally are in a kind of a push-pull or seesaw relationship, whereby very stimulatory, high dopamine-releasing activities and pornography and things like that increase dopamine, but repeated exposure to that, regardless of the activities occurring during that time, lead to big, long troughs in dopamine, such that more stimulation is required just to get any sense of arousal. We also know that prolactin, when that is increased, tends to create a kind of subdued lack of dopamine, amotivated, non-motivated state. There are reasons for this biologically, right? After ejaculation, the idea is that animals won't then, or humans won't then copulate again and again and again, at least not for some period of time. The duration of the refractory period is highly individual. It's determined by age, by species. There's the so-called Coolidge effect. Are you familiar with the Coolidge effect?
I'm familiar with post-nut clarity.
Okay. Slightly different. There's an anecdote that, at least to my understanding, is true. At least the Coolidge effect is a known thing in neuroendocrinology, whereby President Calvin Coolidge, reportedly, was visiting a chicken farm with his wife. They were touring the farm, and there were a lot of hens and a lot of chickens generally. And the docent who was showing them around said, you know, this rooster here, pointed to a rooster, copulates more than 300 times per day. It's remarkable. And Mrs. Coolidge turns to President Coolidge and says, you hear that? 300 times per day. She's obviously quite impressed and letting him know that. And Coolidge, that is President Coolidge, says, but let me ask you a question. Same hen or different hens? And the docent says, different hens. Now, here's the phenomenon, the Coolidge effect. It exists in rodents, it exists in chickens, it exists in dogs. People can speculate whether or not it exists in humans, whereby if an animal copulates, then the male is in a refractory period lasting anywhere from minutes to hours to days, depending on age, species, etc. During that refractory period, they can't achieve erection and or ejaculate again. But if you replace the mate with a novel mate, the refractory period is shortened substantially. Why? The answer is very clear based on actual measurements of brain. Why? Because dopamine is also associated with novelty. Now, the refractory period probably serves an important evolutionary role whereby it improves pair bonding so that post-ejaculation, post-orgasm, okay, here I'm interchangeably talking about these for males and females. You know, anytime you hear ejaculation, then people think males, it's there. Post-orgasm, post-coital bliss, pair bonding, the sharing of pheromones, the sharing of stories, you know, the sharing of affection, right? The sharing of a bed to sleep in. These things are intimately involved in pair bonding. So I'm not saying that the refractory period is a bad thing. What I'm saying is that dopamine can overcome the refractory period, but the refractory period itself is largely due to an increase in prolactin that suppresses dopamine. So let's go back all the way to this question about pornography. What's the typical scenario? Well, this is not something I choose to think about a lot. You're talking about some individual in their apartment or home watching intense dopamine-stimulating pornography in which they presumably are aroused or not aroused. They do or don't do whatever they choose to do, but that over time has less and less of an effect in getting them aroused. And keep in mind that none of this necessarily translates to real world human safe interactions. between individuals, right? Pornography is very, very different than real-world sexual interactions. So there is a phenomenon that is starting to surface on the internet. What do I mean by that? I mean, there are a lot of questions posed in podcast forums, meaning in the comment section on YouTube, about, is pornography dangerous? Is it bad, etc.? I think the thing that we can say for sure is that any behavior, any substance that stimulates a lot of dopamine and that is easily accessed without effort is potentially problematic.
If you're struggling with nofap, you're not alone. Hundreds of men have picked up our nofap guide. Inside, we cover proven techniques to help you curb your addiction so you can be PMO-free. One of the most useful things that I learned was changing your environment in order to create different pathways in your brain and stop the negative relapse loop. I cover it all and so much more in the guide. Check it out today. Links are in the description. Now back to the video.
But when it comes to pornography, because of the, as you pointed out, the ready availability of pornography, in particular, let's just call it intense pornography, or that includes a lot of different other stimulatory elements, multiple people, a lot of scenarios that can be accessed on the internet, right? Certainly not things I'm suggesting people go look at, but that is potentially problematic because it raises the threshold of the person that's viewing this as what is arousing, to the point where pretty soon they need those hyperstimulatory environments or stimuli in the form of pornography in order to get aroused. And again, none of that translates into the ability to have conversation with partners or the ability to have discussion in real world circumstances. And of course, everything we're talking about could also be translated to real world circumstances, but the data really point to the fact that younger people in particular are consuming more pornography. So we're talking about bigger dopamine increases with less. When I say effort, what I mean is kind of the more traditional thing was, at least when I was growing up, was you'd go out on a date or you'd meet somebody and there's a series of events that would happen prior to physical interactions, right? So this is potentially serious and problematic. There's a lot of judgment, and understandably so, because people arrive to this sort of discussion with a lot of different backgrounds in terms of religious backgrounds and what they think is okay or not okay. What I can tell you for sure is that I hear from a lot of young males about their challenges with porn addiction, and they want to know how to get over porn addiction. And the answer there is difficult, but very simple, which is abstinence. It's abstinence. It's taking a period of abstinence from pornography, maybe forever, maybe reducing the amount. This is where it gets very tricky, very subjective, and it's almost impossible to kind of have the discussion without getting into some murky territory.
Yeah.
But it's a real issue. And I know it's a real issue because I hear from thousands over the last few years of the podcast. I've heard from thousands of males that are like, they were addicted to porn.
Ready to conquer nofap? Grab our digital nofap guide now. End your porn addiction. Skyrocket your self-esteem and achieve your goals. Packed with proven techniques, expert advice, and relapse prevention tricks. Click the link below and break free today.